When anyone seeks to form a metagame, bans are almost always bound to happen. In the effort to maximize fun and viable options, we stop certain strategies from being used. For example, it's pretty obvious that Mewtwo belongs nowhere near Gen 1 Overused, and so it's banned. Banning something outright is not unusual, and we have a tier exactly for that called Ubers, and then anything goes on top of that. We call those simple bans. Complex bans are less straightforward. It's when two things, be it an ability, Pokemon, move, or item, aren't banned by themselves, but are banned from being used together. If we let Mewtwo into Overused, but banned it from using any good move, then that's a complex ban, since Mewtwo and those moves wouldn't be banned by themselves, but using them together would be banned. Complex bans have a fascinating history across Smogon singles that still informs modern decisions, including what constitutes a complex ban. And since this is a big topic, I've brought some help. Today we have self-described Pokemon Warlord, Gen 9 enthusiast, and participant of the Smogon World Tour who swept the early rounds and made it into False Swipe Gaming's videos, only losing round 5 because he forgot the schedule. Emptymap.
Wow. Okay, so I'm not exactly as glamorous as William here describes me, and I really only started getting into Showdown during Gen 8, but I'll do my best covering the modern generations to the best of my ability. So, without further ado, let's dive straight into it. Take it away, William.
So, join us today as we cover the history of complex bans, and in this video, we'll be covering these competitive formats. With the lack of items and abilities in Gen 1, complex bans had less options to form, especially as Smogon only began playing RBY starting in the 2000s. Before this, Nintendo Cup was the official competitive format, and they did not use many complex bans, or any at all, in that format. So for most of its history, RBY had no complex bans. But then, April 2022 rolled around, and the most recent complex ban happened. In Underused, Agility Partial Trapping was being suspected for a ban. In Gen 1, moves like Clamp, Wrap, and Fire Spin make the opponent unable to move for that turn, except for switching, hence Partial Trapping. Also, using Agility messes with Gen 1's paralysis. If you use it while you're paralyzed, then it just gives you twice your speed, so it just ignores the paralysis. But if you use Agility, or any stat boosting move, while your opponent is paralyzed, then the game reapplies the paralysis speed drop. So that Pokemon then gets reduced to 1/16 of its original speed, which is abused a lot in many formats. But the main point we're trying to get here is that when you use Agility to outspeed the opponent's team, even if you're paralyzed, you can spam Wrap, Clamp, Fire Spin, whatever, as many times as you want until they miss or you run out of PP. And you, the person on the other side of it, would be completely powerless to stop it. In Overused, the Pokemon's power level is such that Dragonite and Moltres, who are the best users of this strategy, can't consistently pull it off, so it's not banned there. Not to say it's not hated, it's called cheese and a whole lot of other insults, because it really is often just not fun to play against if the opponent is trying to make it not fun. It was so bad that people really started using Toxic to beat this strategy in Underused, because so many games would just devolve into RNG, waiting for your opponent to miss a Wrap so that you can KO the Dragonite or something. So, if you saw my video on Gen 1 Toxic, you know it's not good, and this is pretty much the only use case that is legitimately viable for it, because at least you have something doing damage each turn as your opponent is spamming Wrap and trying to get you into Hyper Beam range. Agility, by itself, is not broken, and players liked having Tentacruel, the best Pokemon in Underused, use Wrap as a surrogate U-turn, so you could Wrap the Pokemon, they can't attack, you switch out. It's kind of a U-turn, right? Dragonite had so many other sets too, and banning Dragonite would just remove all those sets from the metagame. Not to mention, Moltres, Dragonair, and Rapidash could just do the same thing, except, slightly worse, but pretty much do the same thing. With this set of very odd circumstances, that being Agility is not broken, Wrap is not broken, Dragonite is not broken, all three combined is broken, a complex ban on Agility Partial Trapping was enacted. It wasn't overpowered, but it made the metagame much less fun to play, and so it had to go. On the side note, RBY Tradebacks has some conversations about complex bans, especially with Lovely Kiss on Snorlax. Tradebacks are when Pokemon from Gen 2 are traded back into Gen 1, and moves that you can't get from Gen 1 normally are banned from use. I suppose you could say it's a complex ban, but the original meta wouldn't actually have these bans, and it's unlikely that tradebacks will displace RBY because people generally like having a metagame they can know is stable with the older generations. So, it's probably not happening. But, ultimately, Hypno and Persian are banned from using Amnesia and other stuff like that. So that's cool, I guess. With the metagame still being niche, when Gen 2 was the main generation, more complex bans were enacted with new moves. Until 2009, Raikou and Zapdos were banned from using Hidden Power, with the main reasoning being that in the real game, getting the hidden power you wanted was incredibly unlikely. Now, of course, this reasoning was very, very weak. It mostly came about because the community back then was much smaller and often was revolved around a small council of what people thought would be healthy if you decided to go to a tournament. Not to mention, of course, Nintendo Cup was still the main format for most of Gen 2's existence. But the reasoning for this is just not particularly sound. Not because, first off, you're playing on a simulator, so who cares about how hard it is to get the Pokemon in the real game, as long as it's possible. Second, Zapdos is just sitting in the overworld in Gen 1 and also in Gen 2. So you just catch it and you just reset until you get the hidden power you wanted. Raikou was a little bit more of a problem, but just see the first point in there. And also, all of your Pokemon, for the most part, would be completely leveled up with perfect IVs or some other IV that you wanted to get a certain hidden power. And if you could use it for them, like freaking getting hidden power bug on Machamp, then why not let Zapdos use hidden power ice? And so, this ban was lifted in 2009. However, the more important reason that ban wasn't lifted sooner was because thoughts of Zapdos and Raikou over-centralizing the metagame were a big talking point. And this more or less did happen, as Raikou and Zapdos are still very much elite Pokemon in Gen 2 overused. Even though Raikou has fallen off a little bit, Zapdos continues to be incredibly overbearing, unless you have like a Snorlax to take it. Which, in all fairness, Snorlax is even more broken than Zapdos, so everyone uses Snorlax. But what this meant for the metagame was that most hidden powers were allowing you to deal with ground types. So Pokemon like Golem, Steelix, Nidoking couldn't really switch in now that Zapdos and Raikou had hidden power water and ice. And for the most part, the only ground type that really rose to this challenge was Quagsire, because unless they had a hidden power grass, Zapdos and Raikou couldn't really KO Quagsire consistently. So, now that it's kind of the modern metagame and with some influence there, Zapdos and Raikou have full access to hidden power. Now, on the next note, Gen 2 also brought some nasty move combinations that got complex banned, like agility partial trapping. Trapping moves like Spiderweb and Mean Look were the main problem here. The first ban involving this is Sleep Trap. If you put a Pokemon to sleep that doesn't have Sleep Talk and then trap it with Mean Look or Spiderweb, then you had free reign to do whatever you wanted. You could Baton Pass to another Pokemon, boost to the maximum with a Cursed Snorlax or Swords Dance Marowak that also got boosted with Agility, and then the game was basically over. Keep in mind, of course, in Gen 2, at this time, there were no restrictions on Baton Pass. In addition, if you wanted to just do something simple, you could just use Perish Song and then just grab a free KO by stalling out those turns. Mischievous was very well known for using this nasty trick. You would Mean Look the Pokemon, use Perish Song, and protect Pain Split, Hypnosis, whatever you wanted to, in order to make sure that Pokemon would not move until they got KO'd, and then you could probably do this again. Now, Smeargle wasn't quite as good because it's a little gimmicky, but it had an even higher ceiling because it could do anything, pretty much. You had 100% accuracy, Sleep with Spore, you had Spikes, you could use Baton Pass, and then pass any boost you wanted. Like, you could use Agility on your Smeargle and then pass to a Marowak that would Swords Dance, and then the game was basically over. That wasn't really great. And it's kind of hard to know what Smeargle's gonna do because it could learn anything. So, it was a little tricky. And Umbreon also contributed. And since Umbreon was actually just straight up viable, like Misdreavus, on teams that didn't spam Baton Pass and Mean Look or whatever, this was not really great because you could instantly just end the game with very, very little counterplay. And hey, when you're asleep, you can't react, you can't switch, you can't do anything. The game is not interactive. Most would say it's not fun. And so, sleep moves with trap moves are banned. But that wasn't enough, because trap moves with baton pass were also banned. You had too much control and could get some threats to spiral out of control, or at least grab a free KO. So, in Gen 2, sleep trap and trap pass were banned. Gen 3 brought more power in abilities, which opened up more floodgates to complex bans. Back in the day, the community focused more on honor, and many cheap strategies were used less because of that. In Overused, this mostly revolved around Baton Pass. And you're gonna notice a pattern here, because Baton Pass is the move responsible for the most amount of complex bans in the history of Smogon. It's responsible for more complex bans than anything else, probably everything else combined. It is very, very difficult to balance, and wasn't helped by the fact that the Gen 3 players wanted to preserve early Baton Pass because of all the early legitimate uses for it. For example, Jolteon is a fast and powerful Pokemon. Your opponent can send Dugtrio to try and kill it. But since Jolteon is faster than Dugtrio, early game, if it can't kill the Dugtrio with hidden power, it can use Baton Pass to escape Dugtrio. Or it can also scout switches, sort of like U-turn in the later generations. They really did all they could to keep Baton Pass around, but it just was not going to work. It often just removes skill from play, and it just devolves the game into a matchup check. In short, they first banned Ingrain on Smeargle, because Skarmory was then allowed to phase more easily, and I guess Roar Tyranitar and any other phaser. Then, they limited it to 3 users per team, because it still wasn't enough that Smeargle was banned from using Ingrain. And its old school German player base, which was the best when Advanced was current, only had 2 users per team as a limit, so copying that, 3 users per team. Still wasn't enough, because Smeargle was still facilitating these teams to no end, so they banned Smeargle. And that still wasn't enough, so they decided to remove the previous bans and then made it so that only one Pokemon could pass stats, and only one method of boosting stats, even though every single member could have Baton Pass. For example, you can have every single Pokemon on your team with Baton Pass, but none of them were allowed to pass stats, except for one. And say that Pokemon was Celebi, right? It could use Calm Mind and then pass the Calm Mind to like a Zapdos or something, right? But it wouldn't be allowed to also use Agility or a Berry or anything like that, because that would be another way of boosting stats, and you can't pass more than 2 ways of boosting stats. And so, you can't do that. You can't even hold a Berry, because that could also boost, I don't know, speed or something, and then the game would very, very much be swung in your favor. And of course, that still wasn't enough, because so many things about Baton Pass are broken, so Mr. Mime and the soundproof ability were banned to make phasing easier. For context, Skarmory is probably the main phaser that you'll see on most teams, if they phase at all. And Skarmory normally likes to use Roar, due to it being a TM, so that you can use Roar in conjunction with Drill Peck. Unfortunately, due to some wackiness, Skarmory cannot use Whirlwind in addition to Drill Peck. So that gimps its coverage and forces it to use Hidden Power Flying, which is much weaker and worse against the rest of the metagame, but just exists so that Whirlwind is usable. And of course, Whirlwind is not blocked by Soundproof, but Roar is. And of course, that still wasn't enough, because they also had to ban Trap Passing, just like in Gen 2, because it was so overpowered. Well, that was crazy, and in Ubers, Baton Pass was so powerful that only one Pokemon was allowed to run Baton Pass. But even more hilariously, Wobbuffet and Wynot can't use Leftovers, because the 2 of them would create an endless battle. So let's say you switched in a Wobbuffet against a Choice Bandit Pokemon, or something, I guess. And then you knock it out, because of course it's using, a physical move, you could counter it. And then your opponent, of course, coming out of that switch, decides to send in their own Wobbuffet. In Gen 3, 2 Shadow Tag Pokemon cannot switch out versus each other. So if they're facing off, the game would not end, because Leftovers heals more than Struggle does damage. Especially considering that you have to exhaust all the PP to begin with, of like counter Mirror Coat and whatever. So, unless you chain together like 40 consecutive critical hits, the game just would not end until someone forfeited. And that's a very odd scenario. Leftovers aren't broken. Wobbuffet is broken from overuse, but no one really thought to send Wobbuffet and why not to Anything Goes just because of this. So they decided to ban Leftovers on Wobbuffet and why not? Because why not? Gen 4 brought us Wi-Fi battling, letting players across the world participate in competitive Pokemon battling. And thanks to this, there was an explosion in interest in the competitive scene. And Smogon became more entrenched in wanting complex bans to not be used as much because they wanted standardization. And this ultimately brings us to the modern understanding of complex bans by Smogon. Yes, you can make something not broken with a complex ban. Like, I don't know, Mewtwo, you can't use any attacking moves or something like that. Yes, it would not be broken. But what is the point of a tier system if you're trying to tier all the Pokemon based on their usage if you just add these tiny rules everywhere? You can make anything not broken with complex bans. You can let Kyogre and Groudon into overused if you just made them level 60 or something ridiculous like that. Like, obviously, yes, that could work. But why would you do that? They first banned Baton Pass to one Pokemon that couldn't pass speed and another stat when Baton Pass started rearing its ugly head again to force some complex bans. Gliscor and its pre-evolution Gligar were ripping up the tier something nasty by using Rock Polish and Swords Dance to pass to something like a Medicham and then instantly end the game, because nothing could really deal with that. With that ban out of the way, it seemed like most things would be solved, but some Pokemon were just not meant to have certain stats boosted. Like Manaphy, if you boost its speed and then it uses Tail Glow, the game is not winnable for most teams from that point onwards. Baton Pass was banned and Gen 4 had no complex bans. The ban on Baton Pass in Gen 4 happened after the bans in Gen 6 and 5, but we're just talking in generational order here. Gen 5 went through the same journey with Baton Pass as Gen 4, so we won't say that again. More importantly, the moment you've all been waiting for, the complex ban, to end all complex bans, and raising tons of questions of whether or not we should enact more complex bans. It's Alderaa's proposal. Back in the early days of Gen 5, Chaos was dominant. You have Pokemon like Darkrai, all the Deoxys forms, Shaman Sky, Sandrush Excadrill, whatever, all that stuff ripping up the tier something nasty. And once it settled down and all those waterless threats were banned, Kingdra, Omastar, Ludicolo, and friends were outspeeding everything and using boosted Hydro Pumps to annihilate whatever didn't have an immunity. So, with some discussion on trying to preserve diversity, especially with rain teams, since it was seen that Gen 5 was becoming the weather generation, it would be kind of a signature mechanic in a way, Alderaa's proposal was enacted, which banned Drizzle in conjunction with Pokemon that had the ability Swift Swim from being used on the same team. It would preserve teams that used Rain Dance and rain teams that didn't use Swift Swim and other stuff like that. This is probably the most controversial ban ever, because this is, of course, the complex ban to end all complex bans. And it kept going, because turns out Sun and Sand were also doing the same thing. So Drought and Chlorophyll were not allowed to be used on the same team. Sandstream and Sandrush were not allowed to be used on the same team. That is, of course, until rain teams proved their brokenness again and started using Sandrush Excadrill to start obliterating sand teams. And sand teams were put in a horrible position, because if they won the Weather War, they would have to deal with something so powerful they weren't allowed to use it themselves. If they lost the Weather War, then you have like 4 abusers of weather on the opposing team, ready to clean up, and so Sandrush was just banned as a whole. You might be wondering why Swift Swim and Chlorophyll weren't just banned as well. Turns out sand teams were the dominant strategy for large stretches of Black and White's history, and bringing those Pokemon would often just be dead weight, as Sun teams were never the most dominant and you didn't want to tech something to just beat Sun teams, and Sand teams often faced off against each other. Like, it could work if you wanted to bring in a Kingdra against the opposing rain team, but not only would they have a ton of water types to probably resist that, and also, Ferrothorn, but it will also just be dead weight against other sand teams. And now you're playing 5v6 just to counter a rain team that doesn't completely fold already to your Kingdra. As we can see in this generation, complex bans were only enacted in extreme and strange circumstances, and they were rarely the first solution to anything broken. Now, there's much more discussion to have about this, so that's why Emptymap, take over.
Finally, we're moving on from the Stone Age and on to Gen 6. What a time to be alive, and totally a meta that I was around to experience. Anyhow, let's get to talking about the main hot button complex ban of this generation, the resurgence of Baton Pass. Now, it's clear that the Smogon community wasn't quite ready to abandon Baton Pass, but Baton Pass allowed for an unhealthy and uncompetitive setup chain that often made the experience significantly less reliant on skill. Familiar suggestions of limiting the number of baton passers in a team, banning the use of Baton Pass in conjunction with certain abilities, such as Speed Boost and Magic Bounce, specifically targeting Scolipede and Espeon, or simply just doing nothing about it were brought back into the spotlight. The community would go on to vote to limit Baton Pass to 3 Mons on a team on the 11th of June 2014. However, this decision was later revised just a month later to only allowing 1 passer per team, since it was insufficient in limiting the ever-so-powerful Scolipede, Smeargle, and Espeon baton pass chains. The restriction of 1 baton passer per team would allow styles that weren't considered as broken, such as Smash Pass, to still exist while removing the most cumbersome effects Baton Pass had on the metagame. Yet, a new strategy soon arose to once again prove Baton Pass's overwhelming power as a tool for setting up and unleashing total devastation. Geopass. With some additional support, people would build team structures centered around the core idea of Smeargle passing a Geomancy boost to a stored power Espeon, a +2 to special attack, +2 to special defense, and +2 to speed, which quickly proved to be an overpowered and uncompetitive strategy. The council yet again revised their decision around Baton Pass, but now only allowed 1 baton passer per team with the rule of not being able to run it with any kind of stat boost, including speed boost. This desperate song and dance to preserve Baton Pass was eventually deemed a pointless, arbitrary endeavor, and it was later decided that Baton Pass was to be banned entirely in competitive Gen 6 singles, along with the generations going forward. Another issue that I'd like to bring up for Gen 6 that started rearing its ugly head towards the end of 2013 is the evil machinations of the Fun Bro set that I could only truly imagine was cooked up by a deranged lunatic. The idea behind it is to trap an opposing Pokemon that can't KO Slowbro in 2 hits with Block, and then proceed to make the game infinite with Slack Off, Heal Pulse, and Recycle with a Lepa Berry to get your PP back. Eventually, your opponent will surrender, realizing the sheer futility in their actions and the incomprehensible insanity of the Fun Bro user. If you couldn't tell by now, this strategy is the absolute definition of uncompetitive nonsense, and the meta would clearly be healthier without any further strategies like these propagating around. And it's for these types of situations that Smogon likes to resort to a complex ban. So we saw the establishment of the Endless Battle Clause to abolish these sets and prevent them from becoming an issue in the future.
And not only that, they actually made that a universal Smogon clause. So even in Anything Goes, you cannot bring the Fun Bro set.
Moving on to Gen 7, we start to see the decline of an era. As far as I'm aware, there are no complex bans distinct to Gen 7. However, the council decision to suspect Arena Trap and their justification as to why suspecting such a lowly distributed ability falls in line with their new policy of avoiding complex bans like the Plague offers much for discussion here. This ban harkens back to the Shadow Tag ban in Gen 6, where instead of suspecting Gothitelle, the most problematic user of Shadow Tag due to its impressive synergy with Mega Sableye on stall teams, it was decided that Shadow Tag itself was to be banned entirely. So if all Pokemon with the Shadow Tag ability were potentially broken, including Gothorita and Wynaut, why was Arena Trap not considered broken in Gen 6? Well, the answer lies in the exploration of Arena Trap's potential in the Gen 7 meta. With a +20 boost to its base attack stat and access to the powerful Ground DMZ, Dugtrio was eviscerating the mons it would trap. There are other nuances to Dugtrio's position in the Gen 7 metagame before Arena Trap would go on to be banned, such as its synergistic potential with Zard Y in removing defensive checks such as Toxpex, Heatran, and Chansey that further contribute to the case of Dugtrio's potential in Gen 7. Arena Trap's popularity in Gen 7 would allow for new developments in previous metas that would lead to its retroactive banning in Gens 4, 5, and 6. But wait, isn't Smogon opposed to banning signature abilities over the Pokemon itself? While that is true, the justification given for this case offers clear insight that will help us tremendously in understanding the conversations that would go down in Gens 8 and 9 as well. According to Finchinator, things that aren't broken or unhealthy or uncompetitive only in vacuums can contribute to the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. Consider how potentially broken elements would be with average distribution on average VST Pokemon. If Shadow Tag was on, let's say, 4 to 5 OU potential Pokemon as opposed to 1 or 2, and the average VSTs were something like 80 across the board, would it be broken? The takeaway from this is to not ignore distribution, but if lowly distributed, to assume how the element would take away from team building or battling skill if it was distributed to average Pokemon in an average quantity. Moving on to Gen 8, we've now reached a generation that I feel completely comfortable talking about. Generation 8 offered a lot of examples of potential complex bans that Smogon completely avoided, with the ones that particularly spring to my mind being Dracovish's Vicious Rend, Cinderace's Libero, and Galarian Darmanitan's Guerrilla Tactics. But reviewing all of it is unnecessary since no such complex ban was ever established. Instead, we can take our time exploring the evolution of Smogon's mindset by reviewing how they handled the meta-defining threat that was everyone's favorite Gen 8 fossil, Dracovish. Dracovish was a sheer menace in the Sword and Shield metagame. Although its base 90 attack and 75 speed might not seem fitting for a Pokemon whose presence many regarded as monstrous, the answer behind the mystery of Dracovish's sheer power lies in its Strong Jaw ability and its Vicious Rend. Its ability Strong Jaw powers up biting moves by 50%, giving a powerful boost to the 85 base power move Vicious Rend, which self-doubles in power if its user moves first in the turn or if the opponent switches out. The resulting blow would deal devastating damage on any Pokemon unfortunate enough to stand in its way. Dracovish's influence on the meta was clearly unhealthy, forcing many teams to run the less than stellar Water Absorb Seismitoad to have fighting chances against an opposing Dracovish. It's clear here that Vicious Rend is a broken element on Dracovish. However, as we all should know very well by now, we must determine whether Vicious Rend as an element itself is inherently broken move, or if Dracovish is the real problem. And it would seem that the only other user of Vicious Rend, Arctovish, is seen biding away its time in ZU. Now, that doesn't mean Arctovish is completely unusable in upper tiers, and in fact, part of the reason why Arctovish suffers in the lowest tier is because of NU's ban on Slush Rush, which is perhaps a potential topic for another day. However, if we employ the same reasoning we saw in the Gen 7 segment, Arctovish suffers from a lot more than you might expect from the average VST Pokemon. First of all, its typing really doesn't lend itself much defensive utility or switch-in potential, and second of all, the thing only has 55 base speed. Even ignoring its typing, if Arctovish was simply faster, it would have much more potential. But now the question remains, would it have the potential to break OU even without Strong Jaw? The only way to know for sure is to put it into practice, but having to do this for every Pokemon or every element that seems remotely broken would be an incredibly hefty challenge for Smogon to bear, and I suspect that this is the underlying reason behind why Smogon prefers simpler bans. As the creator of Showdown, Zarel states, you can make any Uber Pokemon non-broken in OU just by banning the part that makes it good. Deoxys A, just ban it from using any physical or special move. Let me tell you, we can easily implement that ban on our server and it's very easy to comprehend. Goes on to state, in case it was unclear, the problem with this sort of thing is that it completely defeats the purpose of a tier system. A tier system is a list of things ordered by how strong they are. Of course you can add lots of tiny rules to nerf everything overpowered, but if you do that, it's not a tier system anymore, it's just making your own rules. And the nice thing I like about a tier system is that it's way simpler than a list of rules. When I say any ban that isn't a Pokemon species should be treated as a complex ban, I mean it. Banning an ability is only one more rule, but banning a Pokemon is 0 more rules. It's already covered by OU's first rule. All Pokemon in the Uber tier are banned. The fewer rules, the easier to understand, the less time spent arguing over what the rules should be, the better the game. Now, it should be noted that Zarel's position here on what exactly constitutes a complex ban is relatively niche. However, this mindset does inform a lot of what Smogon went through in Gen 8 and Smogon's thought process going into Gen 9. Now, as someone who personally would have preferred to see Vicious Rend banned instead of seeing Dracovish go, I also see the potential argument that Vicious Rend is a completely separate matter from and is wholly incomparable to limiting a Pokemon's coverage, as Zarel did with Deoxys A in this example, since you're banning the element of Fish's Friend from the game rather than toying with a specific Pokemon's move pool. Fish's Friend will be banned on both Arctovish and Dracovish instead of just limiting Dracovish's moveset. However, it would seem that the Smogon view on complex bans in Gen 8 has evolved to a very deep-seated aversion, and this leads us to the most controversial ban of Gen 9. Let's get straight to it. So as of recent in Gen 9, Terrestrialization has been voted to remain completely legal in the current meta. It remains to be seen in the foreseeable future whether this decision will stand up to the test of time, but had Smogon gone down the route of restricting the Terra mechanic, I believe that this would be quite similar in spirit to a complex ban. However, that's not the main topic for Gen 9 that I want to talk about. So armed with our newly found understanding of Smogon's history with suspect tests, I want to look at what is really the most controversial ban of Gen 9 thus far, the Houndstone ban. Houndstone's signature move, Last Respects, went up in 50 base power for every fainted party member on your side, and with the Sand Rush ability, Houndstone would prove to be a late-game menace that many started to realize was broken and unhealthy. However, besides having the move Last Respects, Houndstone is not broken in any capacity. It may have found some niche in some lower tier with its ability Fluffy and access to moves like Will-O-Wisp and Body Press as a kind of physically defensive support Pokemon. While we know very well by now of Smogon's reluctance to ban signature moves, everyone is aware of the fact that another Pokemon with Last Respects will soon be arriving in Basculegion. With the introduction of Basculegion, it's likely that Smogon will consider banning Last Respects as a whole instead of banning both Houndstone and Basculegion, like how they handled the ban of Shadow Tag, instead of solely banning Gothitelle. Last Respects is an evidently broken move, but why wait until Basculegion arrives to consider action? Wouldn't it be best to simply ban Last Respects now instead of banning poor little Houndstone? I would say that the Smogon Council's decision to ban Houndstone and their current handling of metagame is all geared towards strictly following a policy of simple bans. Instead of banning Rage Fist, for example, the preferred solution would be to ban Annihilate. Instead of banning Shedtail, the preferred solution is to ban Cyclozar, which they just did. I would say that in these cases, Smogon is more justified in avoiding a complex ban because it could be argued that Primeape and Orthworm's lackluster performance in the metagame thus far could prove that both moves respectively aren't inherently broken. In Cyclozar's case, the Mon feels like it's perfectly designed for the job. It has Regenerator to quickly recover back the HP it loses in creating a substitute, an excellent speed stat to allow it to quickly pass a substitute, and excellent support moves in Rapid Spin, Knockoff, and Taunt, as well as other threatening ideas in its move pool like Draco Meteor that really allows this Mon to shine. And Annihilate is a powerful enough Mon on its own with its excellent offensive typing of Ghost and Fighting, and also Terra potential, allowing it to make use of its bulk to tank hits to boost its Rage Fist, and even start setting up with Bulk Up. So now looking over the complex ban discussion in Gen 9, I believe that this should hint towards a dire future for proponents of complex bans. So there you have it, a short overview of complex bans across Smogon formats. Hopefully this video has helped clarify why the Smogon Council thinks the way it does. And if any question or concern remains, make sure to leave a comment and continue the discussion. It's in all of our best interests that these competitive metas continue developing in healthy ways. This is Emptymap signing off.
Thank you for your help and expertise. As you can see from our analysis, Smogon went through a radical shift in thought around complex bans as the generations went on. From the concept not really existing in contemporary RBY, to the willingness to use complex bans in GSC and Advance to preserve the health of the metagame, to the emerging dislike of them in Gen 4 due to valuing standardization, and finally, the complete aversion and extension of what constitutes a complex ban in Gens 8 and 9. Complex bans have a storied history in Smogon, and while we shouldn't use them as the first resort, it's important to understand what scenarios called for complex bans in the past, to know how to balance future metagames. So thanks for watching everyone, I hope you enjoyed the video, comment some video ideas, I'll see you next time.